Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to English 484W. And this week I think I'm going to try to give a kind of a better advertisement than I gave last week for Taipei. So this is actually my third time reading Taipei, and I really think it's a great novel. But it is also kind of a very difficult novel, I think. And one of the things that are difficult about it is its handling, I think, of depression. Um, and obviously, depression is something that most of my, or a lot of people that I know suffer through periods of depression or chronic depression. It's kind of a very big issue today. And there's a certain role that I think that the internet plays. And even this class that we're doing kind of online at a distance, not really interacting in person. Uh, Depression and the internet are kind of interwoven a little bit, I think, and they're definitely interwoven in this story by Dao Lin. So in this lecture, I just want to talk a little bit about how this novel represents depression and kind of going through different perspectives on depression as well. And yeah, I'll just get into my PowerPoint. So that's the monkfish that they talk about. I think they visit the Wikipedia article for it. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about Hamlet, which actually came out of the Discord discussion where Emery began by mentioning something in Taipei that resembled a soliloquy, and Selena added on to that by mentioning Shakespeare. So that did kind of lead me to thinking about this novel Taipei and its resemblance to Hamlet. So just a quote from Hamlet here. He's talking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and I'll just read it. I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, foregone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave overhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire. Why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason! How infinite in faculty! In form and moving, how express and admirable! In action, how like an angel! In apprehension, how like a god! The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me, no, nor woman neither, though by your smiling you seem to say so. So obviously in this kind of description, Hamlet sounds a little bit depressed. And I was doing a little bit of research, and there are people on the internet that are or make arguments or write essays that Hamlet is medically depressed. And that is kind of the reason why he can't ultimately commit the action that his dead father is asking him to do. Obviously, there's some differences between Hamlet and Taipei. Taipei, it's very kind of difficult to discern what action the character of Paul wants to commit. There seems to be no action. But at the same time, he's obviously very indecisive about just taking any kind of action. So it's the condition of Hamlet, but kind of even kind of more severe. And are some also kind of connections between Hamlet and Paul as well. So obviously in this image there's a contemplation of death. Death is kind of a major theme of Taipei, which I'll kind of talk about in the next lecture video a little bit more. Also just resemblance. So at the very end here, Hamlet kind of talks about how women don't interest him either. And that also kind of resonates with the character of Paul, who, though he kind of pursues romantic interests, at the same time, one of the kind of repetitive statements that he writes is that he's naturally losing interest, which is something similar to what afflicts Hamlet. So there's definitely at least looking at these two texts together, there's a definite connection between depression and kind of losing that romantic, I don't know, desire. Um, yeah, so I'll just move on. Okay, so sorry to go back, but in this kind of quote from Hamlet, he one of the things that he does talk about is the sky. So uh, talking about the earth, talking about the sky, this most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave overhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire. He's talking about the sky there, and then it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. And there's very kind of similar descriptions of the sky in Taipei. Is definitely not being beautiful as we kind of think of the sky often. It's been especially beautiful during this time because of the lack of pollution. But in Taipei, the sky is kind of this very kind of gray, uh, yeah, not kind of ugly. So even the first sentence of the book, it starts. It began raining a little from a hazy, cloudless seeming sky, and again with these kind of weird constructions. What exactly is a hazy, cloudless seeming sky? What would hazy even be if it's not clouds? So it's kind of a weird image to think about. But then there's other images of sky scattered throughout the book. I've just chosen some of them. A membranous and vaguely patterned sky like a faded, inconsistently worn red and blue blanket lit from the other side. A uniform cloudy expanse which glowed with the same intensity and asbestos-y texture everywhere, seeming less like a sky than the cloud-colored surface of a cold, hollowed-out sun. So these are just even the moments where the character of Paul is outside during something resembling the day. Uh, a lot of this novel actually takes place, it feels like, during the night. These characters, Paul and Aaron, stay up doing drugs to kind of ungodly hours of the early morning. Paul works in the underground part of a library where there's no kind of sunlight at all. Um, they both Paul and Aaron seem kind of completely detached from kind of everyday rhythms of life. That's getting sleep, waking up to the sunlight. There's almost a fear of the sun in the novel, and if this novel was a movie, perhaps that kind of darkness would be more obvious. But in the novel format, it kind of is a little bit more subconscious that these characters never really go out into nature or live in the sunlight or anything like that. They're kind of vampire-like, and yeah, when you think about what the sun represents, I mean, people around the world have worshipped the sun as the source of life for a long period of time, and these characters seem a little bit afraid of the sun and afraid of life. Okay, so this book by Anne Kvetkovich was very influential, just talking about what exactly depression is. And I'd be interested to hear your guys' kind of thoughts on her argument. But when we're talking about Taipei and when we're talking about the character of Paul, I think Paul is representative of a lot of things that are going on in our kind of society right now. So rather than kind of just like pathologizing him or diagnosing him. Obviously, he talks about how depressed he is constantly, um, and I think he does drugs as well as kind of a coping mechanism for this depression. But I think Anne Kvetkovich's argument is useful. Basically, I won't read out this quote, but basically, Kvetkovich makes the argument that a lot of uh, a lot of kind of mental health today is talked about on a very kind of personal level and is dealt with on a personal level through medication or therapy. But at the same time, there are also kind of reasons that uh, I know there are different levels of depression, and there is chronic medical depression, but there's also kind of a more kind of pervasive social depression, I think, where something about the way that society is constructed today uh, generates this kind of pervasive depression. And that's kind of Kvetkovich's point, that we need to talk about depression, not just on a personal level, not just at the level of medicalizing it or pathologizing it, but as kind of a critique of society. And yeah, one of the questions that I have when reading this book is, why is Paul so depressed? And he might just be suffering from medical depression. Perhaps he talks about the serotonin depletion. That might be a factor to it. But there's also something, I think, at the level of the social that's affecting him. And the obvious kind of easy answer is the internet, I think. And yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video. But Kvekovich also has some kind of useful definitions of depression as a kind of a feeling of being stuck. And definitely, again, this applies to the character of Paul. Uh, Motionless is one of the most common words, I think, in Taipei. He describes himself as being unable to move, or other characters being unable to move, which is really contrasted with how much movement actually takes place in the novel. So these characters go travel quite a bit. They're always kind of moving a little bit, but there's also this kind of motionlessness, paralysis that they suffer through as well. Okay, so yeah, okay, let's go to the next one. So one of the ways that people have analyzed depression is that depression kind of surges during time periods where there's a major shift in society taking place at a historical level. So obviously the major historical shift taking place during Taipei involves the internet, that these characters are living through kind of the early days of kind of the Internet of Things, where like the internet is kind of spreading and expanding into people's lives, and that is kind of the major historical shift I think that's going on. And a lot of the way that we talk about the internet today is through the idea of loss, that we're losing something through kind of putting our lives on the internet. That's something important to the human condition, is being lost. I don't totally agree with that, but that feeling of loss that we experience through the internet is definitely kind of a potential cause of depression. But at the same time, these characters are very depressed, and perhaps the internet plays a part in that. But depression is actually a phenomenon that has a long kind of history. And in its previous definition was in the kind of the religious language of acedia. And acedia was kind of a combination of things. So it was sloth, it was despair, and most importantly, it was treated as a moral failing. So depression and I'm talking kind of the medieval ages at this point, the so-called Dark Ages, depression in the word of acedia was viewed as a moral failing, that you were doing something evil by being depressed. And I mean, that's something that definitely doesn't get a lot of play today. People aren't evil if they're depressed. But that was the view that they had in the Dark Ages. And there was a very kind of a strong kind of spiritual, religious component, obviously, during this time period, that if you were depressed, if you were experiencing acedia, you weren't pursuing God enough, that you were kind of overly distracted by the world around you. So this is just a quote from John Cassine. So this is a picture of him on the right, and this is a 4th century monk. And his description of monks, monks were suffering depression a lot during this time period for some reason. And when I say monks, I mean people who kind of set themselves, who lived in a church. There was the anchorites, who they would build kind of a special room for attached to a church. A lot of these anchorites were women, actually. And these anchorites would just live in the church. They would be kind of walled in. They would never leave the church. They would be given small amounts of food. And they would just live within this very kind of tiny room attached to the church where there was no door. The walls had been constructed around them. It's kind of a very depressing thing to think about, definitely kind of resonance to our experience during coronavirus, being trapped in our own homes. But there was kind of an epidemic of depression that went through these monks at the time, and anchorites at the time. And John Cassine addresses this here, and I'll just read it out because it is really interesting in how much it resembles what the character of Paul is going through, and kind of points to how these are kind of timeless issues, not so much particular to the millennial generation or whatever, but these are the issues that Paul struggles with are issues that, and all the other characters of Taipei, are issues that have haunted the human race since its inception, and not just the human race even. I think animals get depressed. Depression is a kind of a condition of the human experience, or of being alive. So here's the Cassine quote. Carelessly he proclaims himself inept at facing any task of the spirit, and afflicts himself with being always empty and immobile at the same point. He who might have been useful to others and guided them, and who has instead not concluded anything or benefited anyone. Then he begins to look about himself here and there. He enters and exits several times from the cell and fixes his eyes on the sun as if he could slow down the sunset. And finally, a senseless confusion comes over his mind, similar to the mist that envelops the earth and leaves it inert and empty. So, again, I think this description could apply to Paul. Yeah, empty and immobile, senseless confusion, and that kind of the misty kind of experience where there's a lack of clarity as to the purpose or meaning of life. At one point, I think, let me see, where is that quote? On page 161 of my copy, I think at the very top of it, Paul kind of addresses what this book is about. He's thinking about what to do about himself. So he's kind of very confused about his purpose. Okay, so this fellow, Giorgio Agamben, comments on that Cassine quote in a little chapter called The Noonday Demon. And the Noonday Demon was the name given to this epidemic of depression afflicting these monks. And it's kind of an interesting, the Noonday Demon, it was actually light that these monks were, which generated despair in them, not darkness. It was the kind of the movements of the sun, this relentless movement that caused them despair. And again, kind of flashback to Taipei, where these characters are afraid of the sun. They kind of live in or prefer artificial light to sunlight. So Agamben here, he comments on it. Curiositas is the curiosity that seeks what is new, only to jump once again toward what is even newer, and that, incapable of taking care of what is truly offered to it, obtains through this impossibility of sustaining attention, the instabilitas of the fathers, the constant availability of distraction. So Agamben is commenting on these monks who would give up kind of contemplation or meditation upon the nature of God, or give up their reading on a single text, like the Bible, and instead would be driven to distraction. So they would get up, they would leave their cell, they would perhaps have a bunch of different thoughts at the same time rather than just kind of contemplating the majesty of God. They would curse their surroundings. They would pretty much just abandon this kind of contemplation of God. And yeah, they were criticized for being distracted. And I mean, these monks could have never foreseen the distraction capabilities of the internet through things like TikTok, which I've been kind of favorable to TikTok, and maybe we can get into this, but now I think TikTok is very bad. Just because, yeah, that distraction, sometimes I do worry about what it's doing to society. I mean, I think that something like even thinking about what's society itself kind of requires, or thinking about the meaning of life requires kind of deep contemplation that I don't know. I mean, I do use TikTok, but sometimes I worry about what it's doing to me. So yeah, and I should just as a little bit of gossip, Agamben is in big kind of deep water right now because he wrote this polemic kind of comparing any person who does online teaching or who signs up to help the university do online teaching during this time period as being pretty much a fascist. and compared kind of distant online teachers to the Nazi regime. So there is a big kerfuffle about that, but yeah, that's his viewpoint. He's really against remote, kind of distant teaching, and yeah, I mean, I'll be very interested in what your guys' experience of this course has been at a distance. I was thinking about that Tinder article that we read a while ago, where the man kind of runs into his to the person he's been talking to on Tinder in person. And I was thinking what that would be like if I ran into any of you in person. How strange that encounter would be, because we've been interacting just through screens for so long. It'd probably be pretty awkward. Okay, so just one. These are quotes about depression, but they're also kind of depressing quotes. So this is from the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, and he writes that the desperation that is aware of its being desperation, aware therefore of having an ego in which there is something eternal, in which now desperately wishes not to be itself, or desperately wishes to be itself. So the desperation that is aware of its being desperation, that kind of points to like the self-consciousness of the character of Paul. He's very kind of aware of kind of the futility of his feelings. There's nothing really that he's not aware of. But that kind of self-awareness kind of leads to even more kind of depression. He's very aware that he's depressed, but that kind of awareness doesn't really prompt him to make any kind of changes or anything. So this quote just kind of resonates for me with some moments in the text. So let me just see what I got here. So just on page 204 near the bottom of my copy. Manually descending a down escalator, about an hour later, holding Aaron's hand, leading them past people standing in place, Paul realized he was, and for an unknown amount of time had been, rushing ahead in an unconscious, misguided effort to get away from where he was, inside himself. So, yeah, this kind of, desperately wishes not to be itself. Paul desperately wishes not to be himself. At kind of an earlier moment in the text, he talks about hating himself. But at the same time, it's kind of dialectical with that desperate wish to be himself, to be present to himself, rather than just kind of this critical, distant object that he sees himself as frequently. So yeah, there's just one other thing that I wanted to touch upon, because this is a course on kind of relationships on the internet and kind of how problematic they can be. So that the constant availability of distraction that Agamben mentions here, again, I think this really applies to the relationships that Paul engages in, with that kind of frequently losing interest. And he loses interest in Aaron, if you haven't gotten to the end, spoiler, as a relationship develops. He just can't stay focused on a single person, and kind of flits from girl to girl. And yeah, there's definitely a parallel, I think, with the internet going on there, in the way that the internet kind of does facilitate our distraction. At one point in the story, Paul talks about kind of this really common practice, I think, of circling or cycling between all our different kind of social media apps. So he goes to Twitter, he goes to Facebook, he goes to Instagram, and then he goes to his news source, and then he keeps going back, and then the day has kind of disappeared. Yeah, you do wonder how much that kind of constant kind of ADHD tendencies, non-medical, does kind of affect human relationships, where human relationships, at least the monogamous one, involves kind of sustained focus and devotion to a single person. Okay, so yeah, I think that's all I wanted to talk about. So in the next video, I will just be talking about the internet more, and what exactly the internet is doing in this novel. And yeah, spoiler alert for the next lecture video. I'm going to be talking about the internet as the kind of the bad guy of this novel. Although perhaps Paul is the bad guy of this novel. Yeah, I think that's a question. I'll see you guys in the next lecture video. Bye for now.